they rigorously applied the economic concept of imputed rent for owner-occupied housing.
Okay, let me stop you right there, because imputed rent is a concept in terms of a lot of people, including me sometimes, right? If I own my apartment outright and I do not pay a landlord any rent whatsoever, no money is actually changing hands. I'm just living there. So how does me simply living in my own home generate GDP for the national economy?
It's a fantastic question, and it is a core concept of the SNA designed specifically to standardize international comparisons. Imagine two identical houses side by side. House A is rented out for $1,000 a month. That $1,000 is clearly economic output. It's a housing service being actively consumed and paid for.
Easy. That goes on the GDP level.
Right. Now, House B is owned outright by the person living in it. They consume the exact same housing service, the shelter, the comfort as the renter next door, but no cash changes hands.
Because they own it.
Now, if the national GDP only counted House A, a country with high homeownership would appear artificially poorer than a country of mostly renters, even if their actual living conditions and physical wealth were identical.
I think that would totally skew comparisons between countries.
So imputed rent estimates the market value of the rent the owner would be paying if they were renting that exact property and adds that municipal value to each other.
It's a clever fix.
By properly measuring this in 2004, capturing the true scale of except restaurants, consulting firms, the IT services, and logistics networks, the census finally captured the actual lived reality of the population.
The data that came back from the census fundamentally altered the global economic map, didn't it, Agri?
The impact cannot be overstated. When the final data was tallied, the 2004 census revealed an additional 2.3 trillion yuan in production-side GDP.
2.3 trillion, just found it.
Just found it. That represented a massive 16.8% increase over the previously unrevised figures for that specific year alone.
That is insane. It was this size of
enemy structure eliminated.
just discovered.
Hiding the service sector and the composition of that newly discovered wealth is actually the most telling data point of all. 92.6% of this newly added value came strictly from the tertiary sector, the service sector.
Over 90%.
In a single sweeping statistical adjustment, the service sector's official share of production spiked from 31.9% to 40%.
You got nothing, you hear me?
None of that new money they uncovered was from heavy industry building more tractors or forging more steel.
Barely any of it.
It was from the accountants, the restaurant owners, the landlords, the tech workers, and the logisticians who have operated continuously beneath the statistical radar for years.
And this demonstrates the profound systemic and administrative strength of the central government in executing such a comprehensive nationwide statistical overhaul. It was a masterclass in governance.
Because they didn't just stop in 2001.
No, they recognized that it wasn't enough to just update the current year's data. If they only updated 2004, it would look like an impossible physics-defined spike in growth on a chart.
It would look like a typo.
So to maintain historical consistency and accuracy, the NBS undertook the monumental task of revising historical GDP data all the way back to 1952.
Back to 1952.
Yes. They utilized a highly sophisticated statistical methodology called trend deviation.
Yeah, I have to challenge that methodology for a second.
Okay.
If you are retroactively changing data, are you just smoothing out the graph to make the historical narrative look more consistent? I mean, how can we trust that the retroactive adjustments accurately reflect reality? Raw data from those earlier decades didn't capture services in the first place.
That is a very valid skepticism, and it's a question a lot of analysts ask. But the trend deviation method is mathematically rigorous and fully recognized by international statistical bodies. It doesn't just invent numbers out of thin air to make the chart pretty.
How does it work then?
It establishes a correlation between the accurately measured data of
Everything I've got.
steel tonnage, sleep, and the newly measured service economy.
Oh, so it anchors the invisible data to the visible physical data.
It extrapolates back based on the known, documented historical trajectory of the physical output, adjusting for historical price structures. It ensures that the newly monetized services are retroactively acknowledged in proportion to the physical reality of that specific era.
That's actually brilliant.
It is an incredible statistical achievement by the government. This retroactive adjustment is vital because it definitively proves that the growth of the economy was a sustained, methodical, decades-long process. It was not a sudden magical explosion that just randomly began in the late 1990s.
This really
I'm
requires
taking
a
a
massive
pounding,
pivot in
Commander.
how we understand the macroeconomic reality of the past 30 years.
Correct.
We've seen the micro-level erasure with ration coupons, the meso-level absorption by the Danway, the ideological friction of the NPS, and the grand correction of the 2004 census. We have to deconstruct the dominant Western narrative. Some of these largely statistical correction,
Go, go,
what was
go.
actually driving the real engine of growth during this entire period?
We must completely dismantle the widely accepted geopolitical narrative that China merely opened its borders, embraced cheap export manufacturing, and learned how to build wealth from scratch, while the West watched
Minimal damage on that hit.
Which is the story everyone is told.
Exactly.
Yes,
But when we
Commander.
analyze the sequence of events, the abolition of Liangqiao in 1993, the privatization of urban housing in 1998, the Great Census of 2004, we see that these events did not conjure new wealth out of the vacuum.
They just revealed the
We're
real
now
humans.
concerned.
They systematically applied a market price to deeply entrenched, highly developed physical assets and social distribution networks.
Affirmative.
The physical apartments already existed, the heavy industrial infrastructure was already operating, and the educated workforce was already deployed.
Locked on. All weapons.
Foundations rock solid.
The monetization process simply translated that vast existing physical reality into a standardized financial language that Wall Street and international economists were finally capable of.
The implications of that are just staggering for global geopolitics. Western analysts, politicians, and military planners were operating under a state of total
Complete blindness.
because they relied so heavily on flawed nominal US dollar GDP charts in the early 1990s. They changed.
They underestimated the system entirely.
If they
My
had
armor's getting blown apart.
If they had measured the sheer
Waiting for
physical
orders.
output, the millions of tons of concrete being poured, the kilowatts of energy generated, the thousands of miles of paved roads, or even just basic human capital metrics like national literacy rates and rising
Let's take
rely on purchasing power parity, or PPP,
Critical
to
hit,
adjust for the
Commander.
actual cost of living rather than those suppressed nominal exchange rates, they would have seen an economy that was already structurally massive. It was heavily industrialized and vastly larger. The South Korean model that visiting economists was so fond of citing.
Losing
It was a
lots of
textbook
armor.
case of strategic surprise born entirely of analytical hubris in the West. By relying exclusively on a financial metric that was fundamentally broken in the transition to planned economy, external observers allowed themselves to be caught entirely off guard.
And we also have to talk about how the state managed this transition.
Absolutely. We must recognize the stabilizing force that prevented this massive monetization from spiraling into chaos. The state-owned enterprises did not simply vanish when the counting methods changed.
They evolved.
They did. While Western economic models often view state ownership as inherently inefficient and sluggish, the reality of this transition demonstrates a completely different utility. SOEs operated, and frankly continue to operate fundamentally as asset maximizers rather than pure profit maximizers.
Asset maximizers. Okay, explain the mechanics of that distinction. How does an asset maximizer operate differently from a traditional Western corporation?
A traditional corporate entity in the West is driven almost entirely by the need to maximize short-term quarterly profits to appease shareholders.
The next earnings call is everything.
Exactly. An SOE operating as an asset maximizer is mandated by the state to channel massive resources into key long-term
Oh, boy.
strategic sectors that may not be profitable for decades.
Oh, so they have a much longer
Right
horizon.
here.
They absorb the massive capital costs of
Moving
developing
to
aerospace
position.
technology, nuclear power grids, artificial intelligence infrastructure, electric vehicle
Okay,
supply
firing
chains,
up.
and of course the world's largest high-speed rail network.
Things a private company would struggle to fund alone.
Or simply
Standing by.
wouldn't take the risk on. Furthermore, they undertake vital redistributive
way.
roles that a private company would never ever touch. They build deeply unprofitable
All
physical
weapons must
infrastructure in poorer, rugged interior provinces. A private company would say, there's no ROI there, but the SOE does it to ensure national cohesion, balanced regional development, and logistical integration.
It's nation building, not just profits.
This long-term, heavily managed state planning provided the unshakable foundation for the transition.
I don't like how this
The kind
is
of
going.
catastrophic industrial and social collapse that devastated other transitioning economies, such as Russia's chaotic privatization in the 1990s.
It was controlled and deliberate.
The state deliberately retained control of the commanding heights of the macroeconomy. This ensured that the necessary industrial and social base that we built over decades.
Which completely upends the myth that the economic engine was purely reliant on selling cheap consumer goods to the West.
That is one of the biggest misconceptions out there.
The real heavy lifting, the actual sustained engine of this rise, is all of these massive domestic demand and highly coordinated state investment.
Careful macroeconomic analysis consistently bears that out. The massive trade surpluses that dominate Western political rhetoric today, those only truly ballooned around the time of the 2004 census. And even then, these surpluses were largely the result of domestic credit tightening policies aimed at cooling down internal investment, which temporarily slowed the import of raw materials. It wasn't because of some sudden export magic or artificial exchange rate manipulation.
The domestic economy was always the core driver.
Exactly. The institutional maturation of the entire system is methodical, intensely managed, and highly successful. It utilized the mechanisms of the market to optimize micro-level efficiency, while the state retained the absolute capacity to direct macro-level outcomes.
It really is a remarkable narrative of structural reality existing entirely separate from the statistical map used to measure.
The total divergence of map and territory.
We began by standing in a typical grocery store in 1992, looking at the shadow currency of the ration coupon, a simple slip of paper that systematically erased the value of a meal from the global ledger.
We lived
into the walled ecosystem the damn way, where entire municipal networks of housing, healthcare, and education were internalized as factory operating costs. We explore the rigid, material-obsessed ledgers of the Soviet-inspired NPS and how the painful, complex transition to the modern SNA created a massive statistical blind spot that lasted for over a decade. And finally, the immense logistical feat of the 2004 census by the government that forced the ledger to finally align with the physical world, putting a price tag on a giant that had been operating in the shadows all along.
It forces us to completely rethink our reliance on historical economic data. We simply cannot blindly accept nominal GDP figures at face value without interrogating the underlying account mechanisms. We must look at the ideological frameworks and the physical social structures.
This is the great time. Let's do it. Waiting for orders.
Miscalculations and the strategic shocks of the 21st century shaped by a profound misinterpretation of this specific accounting transition.
We misread the numbers.
We did. The giant was never asleep. It managed vast industrial capacity and complex infrastructure entirely outside the field of vision of Western
The deals with realities of the geopolitical hierarchy we navigate today was not determined by a sudden miracle of growth, but by a catastrophic failure of international measurement. We spent decades staring at ledger. Civilization moved the world just on the internet.
We are all gonna die. I'm gonna die.
I was sitting in a century-old cafe in Buenos Aires, the kind with, polished marble tables and waiters who move with this practiced, eerie look.
I can picture that movie.
Yeah, it's a very specific vibe. And across from me, a young man in an impeccably tailored suit was waxing poetic about the, quote, inevitable socialist awakening.
Right.
He was sipping a Malbec that likely cost more than a local convenience legislation and we are the land of the future, he insisted, and his eyes were bright with this borrowed Marxist word.
A very specific kind of revolutionary, I see.
Exactly. He spoke of the dignity of the masses and the shackles of imperialism, all while checking his notifications on a gold-rimmed smartphone. But then the conversation shifted. The news report delivered on the television platform It was something about new land redistribution measures and a protest swelling just 3 blocks away.
Oh, wow. What did he do?
Well, I asked him how his family's massive cattle estate was weathering these necessary reforms. And the mask didn't just slip, it dissolved. Instantly. His face hardened, the revolutionary light vanished entirely, and it was replaced by a cold, ancestral entitlement.
Wow.
Those policies were failures, his voice actually dropped. Not for the families who actually built this civilization. They wouldn't know what to do with the land if they had one.
That is a staggering pivot. From champion of the proletariat to protector of the caste in a single breath.
It really was a revelation. It felt like watching a 500-year-old ghost suddenly inhabit modern life. It made me realize that in this new world, the theater of power hasn't changed its script. It has only swapped the costumes.
Yeah, that cafe interaction perfectly isolates the core mechanic we were looking at for this deep dive.
It really does, because Latin America is a region that mastered the mathematical concept of zero and the complexities of galactic calendars long before the old world discovered it. It exists in what can only be described as a choreography of failure.
Enemy down.
It is a land of staggering literary genius and rhythmic soul, but it remains shackled by a symphony of elitism.
Exactly. Whether it wears the garb of landed nobility, military brass, or socialist doctrine, not as a continent with such profound potential remains so consistently betrayed by its own guardians. Why does the Promised Land always seem to be a horizon that recedes the moment you step toward it?
And exploring that exact question is our mission today.
Go!
Grasp how a region with so much potential remains locked in this cycle, we have to look past the political labels.
Right, because the labels are just a costume.
They've got a walk on me.
The person in charge is wearing a general's uniform, a tailored suit, or a revolutionary beret. We have to look at the invisible architecture holding it all together.
Which means looking at the lingering systems of caste, right?
The constant shadow of foreign intervention.
Commander,
I've got all my weapons. Living underneath all of this, process it through their culture.
The invisible architecture is exactly what you feel when you move through these spaces. To give you an idea of how deeply this is embedded in the physical reality of the region, imagine walking into a private club in Lima.
Oh, those places are practically time capsules.
I was there recently. You step off a bustling, chaotic street, and suddenly you are in this cavernous foyer. The floors are pristine, echoing marble. The ceilings are easily
in a very specific crowd.
The members sitting in the leather armchairs are speaking Spanish with these very sharp, crisp, almost European vowels. I got to talk with him. Mateo actually has a degree in civil engineering, but his last name carries the rhythmic cadence of the Quechua Highlands, the indigenous populations of the Andes.
So the contrast is immediate and physical.
While he was pouring coffee, he nodded toward this massive oil painting hanging in the main hallway. It was a 17th century custom painting.
Wow, literally a map.
Engaging multiple targets.
It's a print portrait. It maps out every possible racial
Waiting for orders.
and assigns it a specific rank in society.
And Mateo pointed this out.
Yeah. Mateo
Move
looked
order.
at it, then looked at the men he was serving, and whispered that the only thing that had changed was the fashion. He described this invisible glass separated These are men whose wealth traces directly back to the original land grants handed out by the Spanish crowns centuries ago.
And you can see that dynamic play out in real time.
Yeah, you could see the roughness of this reality in Mateo's body language. A guest called him son in this incredibly condescending tone, never even looking up from his paper, and Mateo gave this subtle microscopic flinch.
Yeah, it is this quiet, suffocating environment where the elites still view the entire country as their own personal inherited asset.
Engineering has its potential entirely strangled by a social hierarchy established 300 years ago.
And we really have to understand how that hierarchy was built. Because the caste system wasn't just a social suggestion or some cultural prejudice. It was a highly sophisticated, legally codified framework.
It was the law of the land.
When the Spanish colonized the Americas, they didn't just conquer the land, they essentially massive amounts of free or incredibly cheap labor to extract silver.
And you need a justification to force millions of people into that world.
To justify this, they built a caste system. It legally positioned indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans as subordinates.
They've got a sensor
The
lock
place on
on
that
me.
cast of painting dictated your tax bracket, what professions you could enter, where you could live, who you could marry.
So it was basically an economic tracking system disguised as a racial taxonomy.
And the institution of the church was deeply intertwined with this state apparatus. The church helped enforce this social control, funneling immense wealth to a select few elite families while preaching that this hierarchy was somehow part of a divine order.
Right, tying divine right to economic monopoly.
Exactly. They created an institutional framework where economic monopoly
Engaging
and divine
multiple
right
targets.
were completely inseparable.
But wait, didn't they try to dismantle this at some point? I mean, if you look at the 19th and 20th centuries, you have these massive intellectual movements.
You're thinking of the cosmic race.
Exactly, spearheaded by people like Jose Vasconcelos in Mexico, championing this idea of mestizaje, or cosmic race. The idea was that Latin Americans from all these different lineages had blended together to create a new hybrid people.
It sounds wonderful.
Aye, aye.
Right. On paper, that sounds like the ultimate cure for the caste system. Celebration of racial mixing that supposedly erases those old colonial divisions. But does this beautiful theory actually function as an invisibility cloak for
Governments officially declare that we are all one mixed race. It can act as a massive invisibility cloak. If everyone is supposedly part of this cosmic race, then those in power can simply wave their hands and say, racism doesn't exist here anymore. We are all mestizo.
Damage
which is
missing.
incredibly convenient.
You can see
Wow,
daylight
Exactly.
through
It
my
allows the
armor.
exact same colonial hierarchies to persist without any scrutiny because the language to critique them has been officially erased.
That is a brilliant point. It's like declaring you solved a leak in the roof by just taking down the bucket and ignoring the water. And there's data that shatters this cosmic race myth completely. I was looking into the heroic data it's a massive sociological study, and what they did is fascinating.
Yeah, they didn't just
Critical
ask
hit.
people how they identify
A lot of
themselves.
LRMs, Commander.
Because as you said, in 15 out of 25 Latin American countries, the majority of the population just checks the box for mestizo. Instead, the researchers used an 11-point color palette to physically measure and categorize.
The broad umbrella term mestizo hides immense phenotypical heterogeneity. You can have two people who both identify as mestizo, but one looks entirely European and the other looks predominantly indigenous.
Exactly. And when they tracked economic outcomes against that 11-point color palette, the results were staggering. They found that a society operates as a pigmentocracy.
A pigmentocracy.
Yeah.
Your socioeconomic status is mathematically tied to
Engaging
Yes.
multiple
Data
targets.
shows that just a marked increase in the shape correlates with a 4% decrease in hospital.
Enemy mech destroyed.
One shade. It also correlates with a 2 percentage point decrease in upgrade education. So, the darker your skin, the less you earn, and the less likely you are to surpass your parents' education level.
And this is where the statistical methodology becomes really
Heading out.
important. Because skeptics might look at that and say, well, maybe darker skinned populations happen to live in more rural areas with worse schools. But maybe it's just
Right, playing devil's advocate.
exactly.
Yeah.
So to isolate the exact cause, econometricians use something called a Oaxaca blinder decomposition.
Oaxaca blinder decomposition. That sounds like a chemistry experiment. What does that actually mean in plain English?
It's just the statistical technique used to figure out exactly why a gap exists between two groups. Imagine you have two massive piles of resumes. One pile is from
Waiting for
lighter-skinned individuals, the other from darker-skinned individuals. You want to know what the lighter-skinned group is getting paid for. The Oaxaca blinder method lets you mathematically factor out every observable difference and match them up. You compare a lighter-skinned person and a darker-skinned person who live in the exact same family. Then you make sure their parents have the exact same level of education.
Minor damage, Commander.
Then you make sure they have the same years of schooling themselves. You eliminate every single variable regarding geography, class background, and education.
So you are comparing two people who are identical on paper in every conceivable way, except for their physical skin tone.
And what the decomposition reveals is that roughly 72% of these skin tone disparities in human capital and income can
Engaging target.
Almost 3/4 of the income and education gap has
Commander?
absolutely nothing to do with where
I
you grew
copy.
up, what your parents did for a living, or how rural your town is.
Yes, that 72% is the unexplained gap.
Affirmative.
In economics and sociology, when you have a massive unexplained gap like that, after controlling for every other variable, it points a giant glaring arrow directly toward pervasive systemic discrimination.
Because it's the only variable.
It means that discrimination is happening in the hiring process, in the classroom, in
I'm
bank
taking
lending
internal
offices. This aligns perfectly with self-reported data too. Darker-skinned individuals across the region consistently report vastly higher experiences of discrimination in
Right,
schools,
Commander.
public spaces, and when dealing with government officials.
So the class struggle is inextricably entwined with racial injustice. The ghost of the cast of painting is still dictating who gets the loan and who pours the coffee. But here's the thing you have to ask yourself. If 72% of this inequality is unexplained, and the vast majority of the population is demonstrably getting a raw deal, why don't they just vote it away? Or protest? Or demand new systems?
Because the people in power won't just let them.
Exactly. When you have a system that so severely disadvantages the majority, you can't just maintain it. That is where the invisible glass turns into actual iron.
That is the exact pivot we need to make to understand the theater of power. You cannot preserve a grossly unequal status quo without continuous organized force. The elite cannot protect their massive estates and monopolies by themselves. This is the foundation of what we can only call an ugly unity between landed elites and the military. Historically, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries in Latin America, the military did not function the way you might expect.
Right, they weren't exactly defending against foreign invaders.
They acted as the heavily armed enforcers of a compromised state. Their primary function was to crush domestic dissent, break strikes, and ensure that the elite retain control of the land and the export economies.
So the military operates essentially as a taxpayer-funded private security firm for the oligarchs. But we know that not every country in the region looks exactly the same today. They all started with similar colonial baggage, but they took different trajectories. How do we explain why some became hyper-violent dictatorships and others managed to build some semblance of democracy?
To understand that divergence, the framework developed by sociologist James Mahoney is incredibly illuminating. He looks at the 19th and early 20th centuries, which were defined by the global boom in agricultural exports, specifically things like coffee.
And coffee is incredibly labor-intensive.
It requires immense tracts of land and an absolute army of cheap labor to harvest. Between the fully conservative elites over how to modernize their economies and cash in on this export boom.
So how did they resolve
Ready
this?
for orders.
Well, the decisions these elites made about how to secure land and labor sent their countries down vastly different historical paths.
Okay, let's walk through those paths. Because it really comes down to how aggressive the elites were willing to be to get their costs right.
In places like El Salvador and Guatemala, the aggressive, violent move imaginable. They looked at the communal lands held by indigenous populations of peasant farmers and decided they simply wanted them.
Just took them by force.
Yes. The state aggressively attacked and dismantled communal landholding. They stole the land to create massive plantations, and by doing so, they deliberately impoverished the rural population, forcing them to work on these new plantations just to survive.
And to enforce a system that brutal, you need a hyper-violent, deeply entrenched military apparatus.
Consequently, these countries developed extremely harsh, long-lasting dictatorships.
El Salvador is a terrifying case study of this exact mechanism. In the early 1930s, the global price of coffee crashed due to the Great Depression. The oligarchs in El Salvador, often referred to as the 14 families who owned almost everything, they refused to take the loss. Right. Instead, they slashed the already starvation-level wages of the rural workers. This led to a massive peasant uprising in 1932, driven by horrific poverty and sheer concentration of land.
And how did the state respond to its citizens demanding a living wage?
With apocalyptic violence. The military, under General Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, launched a campaign that is known simply as La Matanza, the Slaughter. They didn't just stop the uprising, they waged a war of extermination against their own population.
It's horrific to even think of.
In a matter of weeks, the military slaughtered an estimated 30,000 people. They specifically targeted indigenous communities. Anyone wearing traditional indigenous clothing or speaking the Nahuatl language was executed. They killed union leaders, peasants, and anyone suspected of communist sympathies, including the activist American.
Long-range
The
missile
military essentially
depleted.
annihilated a generation to ensure that the elite's monopoly on the land remained
Roger that.
completely untouchable.
And the mechanism there is crucial. La Matanza wasn't just a burst of violence, it was a foundational event. That absolute assertion of military dominance over the working class traumatized the nation and locked El Salvador into decades of authoritarian rule.
It sent a very clear
Brought it
message.
down,
The
Commander.
military realized they had absolute impunity, and the elites realized they needed the military to survive. It set the stage for the horrific civil wars of the 1980s. Now, contrast that mechanism with the path taken by Costa Rica.
Costa Rica is the perfect counterexample in Mahoney's
Damage
framework.
minimal.
If El Salvador's military was a heavy iron lid clamped down on a
Good to
boiling
go.
pot, Costa Rica decided to just turn off the stove and throw away the lid entirely. In Costa Rica, the elites didn't launch massive attacks. The geography and historical development allowed for the preservation of small to medium-sized farms. They still had internal conflicts, but the resolution was entirely
Right after the fighting in 1948.
They had a brief civil war over a disputed election. The victorious leader, Jose Figueres, did
Can't
something
expect
that
more hits
sounds
like that.
almost like a fairy tale in the context of global politics. In 1949, he disbanded the Costa Rican army entirely.
Just completely.
Full
Yes,
throttle.
he literally took a sledgehammer to a stone wall at the main military headquarters and handed the keys over to the Ministry of Education to turn it into a museum.
You can't really back that decision was not overstated. By eliminating the military,
Oh,
Costa Rica
I'm
removed the primary tool that elites
Commander,
and
I've
neighboring
lost all my
countries
weapons.
used to violently suppress their
Standing by.
populations and launch coups.
It's just off the board.
But just as importantly, look at the budgetary mechanism. Militaries are incredibly expensive.
Here it
By
comes.
launching the armed forces, Costa Rica freed up a massive percentage of their national budget. They redirected that defense spending directly into economic development, universal health care, and public education.
They fundamentally changed their national business model. Instead of investing in weapons to defend their own citizens, they invested in the citizens themselves.
And it paid off immensely. Costa Rica secured a level of long-term democratic stability and social welfare that is unmatched in the region.
Commander?
They broke the cycle of militarism because the institution required to perpetuate it simply didn't exist.
Listen.
And I want to push back a little here, or rather add a layer of complexity, because not every country just accepted the military. Some countries tried to break these cycles through massive structural revolution. But even then, the results are often tragic. It creates this illusion of revolution.
Dang
Look
it,
at
this
Mexico.
hurts.
The Mexican
Commander,
Revolution from
my neck is
1910 to
going
1920 was an extraordinarily violent, decades-long upheaval. It sought
Ah!
to completely dismantle a dictatorship,
I'm so
redistribute
distracted.
land, and build a socialist, secular society.
They wrote a very progressive constitution.
They did in 1917. It was one of the most progressive in the world.
But what did the implementation of that revolution yield over the next 70 years?
A de facto one-party state. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, held power continuously for decades. Movie director Mario Vargas Llosa famously called it the perfect dictatorship.
The perfect dictatorship.
Yeah, it was plagued by authoritarianism and massive corruption
Aye, aye.
and state violence against student protesters. The rhetoric was incredibly revolutionary. The politicians talked constantly about the legacy. But the actual mechanism of power was just a new elite controlling a highly centralized state. The costumes changed, but the
That
concentration of power
Gone.
We see this pattern repeated continuously. Look at Argentina. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Argentina experienced an absolute economic miracle. Due to agricultural exports, it was one of the wealthiest nations on the planet.
It was incredibly rich.
But that wealth wasn't structurally secure. It was squandered by a toxic cycle of populist socialism, deep political instability, and repeated military coups. The elite in the military continuously intervened to stop populist movements. This volatility ultimately culminated in the horrific dirty war of the 1970s.
The Dirty War is a prime example of the bureaucracy of terror. The military junta didn't just arrest people, they disappeared them.
Right.
It was a deliberate mechanism to paralyze society with ambiguity and fear. They abducted an estimated 30,000 suspected dissidents, students, union leaders, journalists, anyone deemed a threat to, quote, Western Christian civilization.
It's terrifying.
People were tortured in secret detention centers and thrown out of airplanes alive over the Atlantic Ocean.
And Brazil carries a similar trauma. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery, waiting until 1888. The legacy of an incredibly rigid racial caste system right into the modern era.
So those caste lines were very close.
When social movements started pushing for basic reforms in the 1960s, they established a brutal dictatorship from 1964 to 1985 that systematically tortured, exiled, and murdered dissidents.
It's exactly what you observed with the young man in the cafe in Buenos Aires.
Right. The public rhetoric of the state might swing wildly from conservative tradition to populist reform to military order to social revolution. But the underlying grinding mechanism remains the same.
Waiting for
The
orders.
legacy of caste mutates into state violence to protect a very specific elite theater of power.
But here's the critical missing piece. We are talking about these domestic militaries and these local oligarchs as if they exist in a vacuum.
And they absolutely do not.
Right. Militaries need helicopters, they need intelligence networks, and they need international credit. We cannot understand this theater of power by only looking internally. We have to look at the external forces that fund, arm, and pump these domestic needs. We have to look at up here.
The role of foreign intervention, specifically by the United States and global financial institutions, is the engine that keeps this whole recipe of failure running.
And I want to ground this in a specific reality. I was digging through the humid, dusty archives of a small banana exporting port in Central America, and I found the diary of a dock worker named Elias from the late 1950s.
What?
Well, Elias didn't write about grand geopolitical ideologies. He wasn't writing essays about the Cold War or theories of communism. He wrote about the
Ready for orders.
here in the back of his throat.
Ow.
He documented what happened when
Firm.
the northern consultants in crisp linen suits arrived in his town, stabilizing the economy. Within weeks, the local union leaders who had been pushing for better hours simply vanished.
Roger.
The local government drastically slashed the price of land to favor a massive foreign fruit conglomerate. Elias described looking up and seeing white planes circling overhead, dropping propaganda leaflets promising freedom and democracy, while the literal ground beneath his feet was being illegally sold off in the Washington port.
That is such a stark contrast.
First, the most
Warning. Error breached. Internal damage.
meticulously calculated in trembling handwriting that his entire week's wages were rolled on his
Engaging
very
physical
first
attack.
spent 14 hours a day loading onto cargo ships. That is what intervention looks like on the ground. It hollowed out the inside to keep cheap and elite oil. It systematically taught the population that their national sovereignty was merely a
Warning.
commodity.
Armor low.
Elias' diary captures the profound human cost of what was in Washington considered a standard geopolitical strategy. To understand the mechanisms behind those white planes Elias saw, we have to look at the policy shifts following World War
Giving them
II.
everything I've got.
Specifically, of the drafting of National Security Council Paper 68, or NSC 68, in
Turret
1950.
destroyed.
Now, what are those documents actually dictating?
Essentially, they locked the United States into a policy of aggressive, global,
Warning.
anti-communist containment.
Detecting mech warrior injury.
NSC 68
Warning.
framed the
All
Cold
weapons
War as a
destroyed.
zero-sum, apocalyptic struggle.
So everything was life or death.
In the context of Latin America, this doctrine became the ultimate blank check justification for massive, overt, and covert intervention. The tragic flaw in this policy was that Washington began to view
Engaging
absolutely
physical
everything
attack.
through a Cold War lens.
You ain't being important context.
Specifically, if a local labor union wanted an 8-hour day, or if the democratically elected president wanted to tax a foreign mining company, Washington didn't see local politics, they saw
Standing
a Soviet beachhead. Yeah. Any attempt at land reform or asserting national sovereignty over natural resources was immediately branded as a communist threat, making intervention not just desirable, but morally required in the eyes of U.S. policymakers.
And Guatemala in 1954 is
Firing.
the absolute textbook example of how this politics was. It is a masterpiece of cynical interventions. You have a democratically elected president for this. He is not a radical communist. He is a capitalist who looks at his country as this massive, destabilizing inequality. He sees that the majority of the arable land is owned by a tiny fraction of the population, and much of it isn't even being farmed.
Just sitting there.
So he attempts a very moderate land
Engaging
program.
physical attack.
He decides to expropriate 234,000 acres of uncultivated land owned by the United Fruit Company, or UFCO,
Ready for
and
orders.
distribute it to landless peasants so they can actually feed themselves.
And he offered to pay for it, didn't he?
Arbenz didn't steal it. He offered to compensate the
Firing a
FCO. He
full
offered to
salvo.
pay them the exact precise value that the company itself had declared that land was worth on their tax returns.
But of course, UFCO had been massively undervaluing their land
Critical
for
hit, Commander.
years to commit tax fraud.
So they were outraged by the compensation offer. But UFCO didn't just complain to the local courts. They utilized their deeply entrenched ties to the
Multiple
Eisenhower
weapons.
administration.
Ammunition.
This is where the
depleted.
mechanisms of elite networking highly visible.
Oh, the
Warning.
head of the CIA at the
Detected
time was
warrior
Alan
injury.
Dulles. The Secretary of State was his brother, John Foster Dulles. Both men had previously represented the United Fruit Company through their prestigious law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell.
And they owned stock.
Yes, they owned stock.
Engaging
USCO's public
physical
relations
attack.
officer was literally married to President Eisenhower's personal secretary. The conflict of interest was staggering.
It's an entire revolving door
Locking in all weapons.
to the intelligence agencies. So how do they actually work with departments?
Well, UFCO hired Edward Bernays, the father of modern public
Mech
relations,
destroyed.
to run a massive propaganda campaign in the U.S. press, painting Arbenz as a dangerous Soviet puppet. Then, the CIA orchestrated Operation PBSSS.
Which is a second.
inbound, Commander.
Exactly. This wasn't just handing guns to rebels, it was a psychological warfare campaign. The CIA set up a pirate
One left
radio
structure.
station that broadcasted fake reports of massive
Mission successful.
convincing the